On August 2nd, 1985, Delta Flight 191 crashed. Mark Stevens, age 25, recounted seeing something in the clouds before the crash. What he saw was terrifying. His story was dismissed by the doctors and the media as trauma-induced hallucinations. No mechanical failure was ever found, but to this date they say the reason for the crash was a microburst, which resulted in a runway undershoot, thus crashing the planes. This is what Mark told the authorities. Boarded the plane in Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport. It was a clear day, and everything seemed normal as settled into my seat by the window. This business trip was routine, and I was looking forward to a few days in Dallas. The hum of conversation around me and the soft background music created a comfortable atmosphere. I glanced around, noting the usual mix of passengers, families, business people, and a few solo travelers like myself. I remember thinking how ordinary it all felt. The flight attendants moved gracefully up and down the aisle, assisting passengers with their luggage and handing out the pre-flight snacks and drinks. I accepted a cup of coffee, thanking the attendant with a nod. As I sipped the warm beverage, I gazed out of the window, watching the ground crew finishing their tasks. The engines roared to life, and soon we were speeding down the runway. The force pressed me back into my seat as we lifted off the ground, and I felt the familiar rush of takeoff. The takeoff was smooth. I remember looking out at the city shrinking below. The buildings turned into tiny specks, and the landscape transformed into a patchwork of fields and roads. Leaned back in my seat, letting out a contented sigh. The initial thrill of flying always faded quickly into a routine part of my travel, and I settled in for the flight. Pulled out a book from my bag, intending to pass the time with some light reading. Just before the final descent, I noticed something odd in the clouds. At first, it was just a flicker at the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow that seemed out of place. I blinked and looked again, but there was nothing unusual. Shaking my head, I returned to my book, telling myself it was just my imagination. The steady drone of the engines and the calm, dimly lit cabin created a tranquil environment perfect for reading. However, the peace was short-lived. The flicker returned, this time more persistent and harder to ignore. I put the book down and focused my gaze outside the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadowy figures seemed to be keeping pace with the plane darting in and out of the clouds. In unnatural movements, I rubbed my eyes, thinking perhaps I was tired. But no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, the figures were still there. Curiosity quickly turned into unease. These weren't just shadows. They had a form, a presence that felt disturbingly real. The way they moved, with an eerie fluidity, didn't make sense. Clouds don't move like that, I thought. I looked around the cabin, wondering if anyone else had noticed that passengers seemed oblivious, engrossed in their books or conversations. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I tried to stay calm. It had to be a trick of the light or some unusual weather phenomenon. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, bringing me back to the present. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some unexpected weather conditions. You please remain seated with your seat belts fastened and will be on the ground within 10 minutes. His tone was calm, but there was an undertone of concern that made my heart beat a little faster. Looked back out the window. They were still there, more distinct than ever. Passengers around me began to shift in their seats, exchanging worried glances. The flight attendants moved swiftly, ensuring everyone was buckled in and reassuring us with practiced smiles. The plane started to shake, a gentle tremor at first, then more violently. The shadows outside seemed to respond, moving closer, almost as if they were the ones moving the plane. My heart pounded in my chest, and I gripped the armrests tightly. The shaking grew worse, and the cabin filled with the sounds of nervous murmurs and a few muffled cries. The overhead bins rattled and the lights flickered. I glanced out the window once more and felt my blood run cold. One of the shadowy figures was tight there, pressed against the glass, staring at me with an empty gaze. It was like looking into the eyes of something not of this world. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. The engines roared, struggling against whatever force was acting upon them. Suddenly there was a loud bang, and the plane violently dropped downwards. It felt like a roller coaster. The lights flickered again, and the cabin was plunged into darkness for a moment before the emergency lights kicked in. The panic among the passengers grew, cries and prayers filling the plane. The flight attendants were doing their best to maintain order, but fear is contagious. The shaking intensified, turning into violent turbulence that tossed us around in our seats. I glanced around, seeing white eyes and white knuckles gripping armrests. My own heart felt like it might burst from my chest. The shadowy figure outside the window was still there, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow causing this, feeding off our fear. Amidst the chaos, one of the flight attendants managed to make her way to my brow. "Sir, please stay calm," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying her own fear. "We're doing everything we can to stabilize the situation." I nodded numbly, unable to find my voice. She moved on, trying to reassure the others. Another loud bang echoed through the cabin, and the plane tilted sharply. My stomach lurched, and I heard people screaming. The emergency oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments, and I fumbled to put mine on, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The figure outside seemed to mock me, its expression unchanged. Through the small window, I could see the other shadowy figures converging, merging into one large, ominous entity. The sensation of being watched, hunted, grew stronger. I could almost feel its cold breath on my neck. The engines made a horrific grinding noise, and the plane began to descend rapidly. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again, this time more urgent. "Brace for impact. Brace for impact." The cabin erupted into chaos, with passengers screaming, crying, and praying. Leaned forward, clutching my knees, trying to brace myself as best I could. The plane shuddered violently, and I felt the pressure in my ears increase. The descent seemed to last forever, every second stretching into an eternity of fear. The ground rushed up to meet us, and I knew there was nothing I could do but wait for the inevitable impact. The shadowy entity outside tightened its grip around the plane, almost as if it was guiding us to our death. We hit the ground with a force that felt like being slammed into a brick wall. The sound of metal tearing and glass shattering filled my ears. My body was thrown forward, and the seat belt bit into my abdomen, knocking the wind out of me. My head struck the seat in front of me, and everything went black. When I came to it, all I heard was screams, cries, and the distant wail of sirens. I was disoriented, my vision blurry, and every part of my body ached. I could see rescue teams moving through the debris, pulling survivors from the twisted metal that had once been a plane. Was in shock, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The memories of the shadowy figures haunted me, their hollow eyes and sinister presence etched into my mind. As I was lifted onto a stretcher and carried away from the wreckage, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, still lurking just out of sight. In the hospital, I told the nurses and doctors what I saw. They listened with sympathetic smiles, but clearly thought it was the trauma talking. They attributed my visions to the stress of the crash and the injuries I had sustained. But I knew what I had seen. Those figures were real, and they were responsible for the crash. The investigators came, and I told them everything I saw. They looked skeptical, but I insisted it was real. They found no mechanical failure to explain the crash. My story about what I saw was dismissed as a hallucination caused by stress. I started having nightmares and flashbacks. Those figures haunted me every night. Most people didn't believe me. Friends and family tried to be supportive, but couldn't understand. I went to therapists and support groups, but nothing seemed to help. The memory of those things, whatever they were, was always there. I still don't know what I saw that day, but I know it was real. They were there, and they caused the plane to crash.